The will was read on a Thursday morning in October, in a lawyer's office that smelled of old paper and central heat. Marvella Tuck sat in the chair closest to the door, which was not a seat of importance but a seat of habit. She had spent 71 years choosing chairs closest to the exit. Not out of fear exactly, out of the particular wisdom that comes from being the kind of woman a room forgets is there. Her son Dale was already talking when she sat down. He was always already talking. Her daughter-in-law Patrice sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, the way a person folds their hands when they're trying very hard not to smile. Marvella's granddaughter Bette had driven her there, a quiet girl of 22 with her great-grandfather's eyes, and Bette was the only one in the room who pulled out a chair for Marvella before sitting down herself. The lawyer's name was Ashworth. He was a compact man with reading glasses he never seemed to actually use for reading, and he had the patient, uninflected manner of someone who had delivered disappointing news to families for long enough that it no longer cost him anything. He opened the folder on his desk and began. Bernard Tuck, Marvella's husband of 49 years, had left the house to Dale. He had left the savings account, the truck, and the acre behind the property to Dale. He had left the furniture and the good china and the Masonic ring to Dale. He had left everything that could be appraised or liquidated or simply used by a man of 47 who already owned a house twice the size of this one, to their son. Marvella sat with her hands in her lap and listened to her life divided without her name attached to any piece of it. Ashworth cleared his throat at one point, and Patrice's hands tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. To his wife, Marvella Louise Tuck, Bernard had left one thing. A property at the end of Cutter's Mill Road in Hatchet County, where his own father had run a small grain and feed operation for 30 years before the business failed. The property had not been in active use since 1987. It was approximately 3 acres, including a main storage structure. The county had it assessed at $4,200. There were 11 years of unpaid property taxes attached to it. Dale made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He stopped it before it became one, but not before Marvella heard it. Ashworth looked up from the folder and said, in a tone of administrative neutrality, that the estate had been settled according to the deceased's specific and clearly stated wishes, and that the only formal requirement now was Marvella's signature acknowledging receipt of the bequest. She signed. Her hand was steady. It had always been steady, even in the years when steadiness had cost her something to maintain. Outside in the parking lot, Dale stood at the hood of his Silverado and said, in the careful voice he used when he was being reasonable, that he thought the most sensible thing would be for her to sign the Cutter's Mill property over to him. He would see to the tax burden, he said. He would handle the demolition when the time came. And she could continue living in the house, her house, the one she had painted and planted and kept for 32 years, as long as she needed to, within reason. Marvella looked at him. She had looked at Dale Tuck for 47 years, from the moment the nurse set him in her arms until this morning, and she had spent a portion of that time hoping he would become someone different than he was. She had made her peace with the fact that he had not. She said she would think about it. She did not say that the moment the parking lot was out of sight, she would stop thinking about it entirely. Bette drove her home. Neither of them spoke for the first 10 minutes. Then Bette said, quietly, that she was sorry. Marvella told her she had nothing to be sorry about. Then Marvella looked out the passenger window at the soybean fields going brown in the October cold and said, almost to herself, that she had always wanted to see what Bernard kept out at Cutter's Mill. Bette glanced at her. What do you mean? Marvella opened her purse and took out a small envelope she had found 3 weeks earlier. Tucked into the spine of Bernard's King James Bible on the nightstand she had not touched since he died in August. The envelope had her name on it, written in Bernard's handwriting, which had gone cramped and small in his last years. Inside was a folded piece of paper with 6 words on it. Find a red door, Marvella. Please. She had carried it for 3 weeks without telling anyone. She had not even told Bette, though she had thought about it. She held it in her lap now in the car and looked at it. Bernard Tuck had been a man of few words and fewer explanations. He had not been unkind. He had not been dishonest, as far as she knew, but he had kept certain parts of himself sealed in the same way that some men seal a room, Not out of secrecy exactly, but out of the certainty that no one else would understand what was kept inside it. His father's old property out on Cutter's Mill Road was one of those parts. He had paid the taxes on it for years without explanation, and when the taxes lapsed, he had not spoken of it, and she had not pressed him. There were rooms in a long marriage that you learn not to open. But he had written her name on that envelope. He had said, please. She showed the note to Bette. Bette read it twice. Then she said, carefully, do you want to go out there? Marvella folded the note and put it back in its envelope. She said she thought she did. If this story is already pulling you in, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if someone in your family was ever left a worthless piece of property that turned out to be anything, but tell me about it below. I read every one. The road to Cutter's Mill was not on any map that had been updated in the last 30 years. It broke off from the county highway past the grain elevator and narrowed almost immediately into two ruts with a grass median, the kind of road that exists because people made a habit of driving the same way, not because anyone planned it. The trees came up close on both sides, hackberry and scrub oak gone ragged with October, their leaves stripped to paper. Betty Civic scraped bottom twice before they reached the clearing. The property announced itself the way forgotten things do. Not with drama, but with the specific silence of a place that has not had to perform for anyone in a long time. The main structure was larger than Marvella had pictured. She had imagined something shed-sized collapsing inward. What she found was a long, low building of corrugated steel and heavy timber framing. The roof intact except for a section near the east end where a tree limb had come down and bent the metal. The steel had gone the color of dried blood, streaked with rust in long vertical lines. The timber framing beneath it, where she could see it, was solid. The building was not falling down. It was waiting. The surrounding 3 acres were overgrown with goldenrod and wild asters gone to seed, and the remains of what had been a gravel drive were barely visible under 20 years of volunteer grass. There was a rusted weighing platform off to one side, the kind that grain trucks would pull onto, and the platform's iron frame was still upright, though the deck boards had rotted through. There were 2 doors on the face of the building. One was a large sliding door, the kind meant for truck access, sealed with a chain and a padlock that had rusted into a single object. The other was a man-sized door set into the wall about 15 feet to the left of the sliding door, and this door was painted red. Not rusted to red. Painted. The paint was old, cracked at the edges, faded to a color between brick and dried rose, but it had been applied deliberately with a brush by someone who meant for this door to be different from everything else on the building's face. The knob was brass, gone green with oxidation, and above it was a keyhole, the old mortise style, the kind that required a long-barreled key. Marvella stood in front of it and put her hand flat against the paint. It was cold. The surface was rough under her palm, where the paint had crazed in the years of freezing and thawing. She felt the wood beneath it, which was solid and did not give under pressure. She tried the knob. It turned, but the door did not open. Locked. She opened her purse and took out the ring of keys the lawyer had handed her along with the signed paperwork. There were 3 keys on it. The first was modern, a house key shape which did not fit. The second was a small flat key, the kind for a padlock, which also did not fit. The third was long, heavier than the others, with a barrel shaft and a simple bit at the end. An old mortise key. She fitted into the keyhole. It went in without resistance, as though the lock had been expecting it. She turned it. The bolt drew back with a clean, unhurried sound. She stood with her hand on the knob for a moment. The wind moved through the goldenrod behind her, and somewhere in the tree line, a bird she could not see called twice and stopped. She opened the door. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the open door and from 2 small windows set high in the south wall, their glass thick with grime. The air that came out was cold and dry, with the specific stillness of enclosed space, dust and old wood and something metallic, faint as a memory. Her eyes adjusted slowly. The space was one long room. The floor was poured concrete, swept clean, which was the first thing that surprised her. There was no 20 years of debris on the floor, no accumulation of dead, leaves blown in through gaps, no scattered animal evidence. The floor had been swept at some point not so long ago, and it had not been disturbed since. Along the left wall ran a series of wooden shelving units, floor to ceiling, and on the shelves sat rows of objects covered in old canvas and burlap. The shapes beneath the coverings were varied, some tall and narrow, some low and broad, some no bigger than a shoebox. Dozens of them. In the center of the room, standing on the swept concrete, was a wooden table. Workhorse-built, thick-legged, the surface worn smooth from use. On the table was a lantern, a box of matches, and a sealed envelope. Marvella walked to the table. The envelope had her name on it in Bernard's handwriting. She picked up the matches and lit the lantern. The light spread out warm and yellow, and the room changed. The objects on the shelves took on weight and dimension. She could see now that the canvas and burlap coverings were tied with twine, methodically and with care. Every object on every shelf was attended to, wrapped, protected. She sat down at the table, the lantern close, and opened the envelope. The letter inside was 2 pages, written on the back of an old grain receipt, because Bernard had never been a man to go looking for special paper when ordinary paper was near at hand. The handwriting was better than it had been in his last months. He had written this some time ago. Marvella, it began. If you're reading this, I'm gone. And you came out here, which means you trusted me enough to come, and I'm grateful for that. I know I don't deserve a lot of your trust at this particular moment, since I'm leaving you this letter in a building you've never seen the inside of, on a piece of land I never explained to you properly. I'm sorry for that. I should have told you years ago. I kept meaning to, and I kept putting it off because I didn't know how to start. Men like me are better at keeping things than explaining them. My father, your children's grandfather, Earl Tuck, you know the shape of him, the grain operation that failed, the drinking that didn't, the years he spent alone out here after Mother died. What you don't know is that Earl was a different man before the business failed, before the bank took the building in town, and before his pride caved in on him. He was a man of considerable patience and considerable skill, and he trusted almost no one and almost no institution, and he acted accordingly. When he came out to this property in the early 1960s, he did not come empty-handed. What he brought with him, and what he spent the better part of 2 decades building and accumulating and carefully protecting, is on these shelves around you. I have checked on it. I have maintained it as best I knew how. I never sold any of it, not even in the years when I was tempted, because he told me who it was meant for. He said it was for the woman with sense enough to look for it. He shook Marvella's hand in the clearing, looked at the building and the red door without commenting on either, and waited for her to go in first. The lantern from Tuesday was still on the table. Bette lit it. Speer turned on his flashlight and walked to the nearest shelf. He did not touch anything. He looked first, moving slowly along the row of covered shapes with his flashlight traveling ahead of him. He made one small sound, barely audible, early in this process, and then he was quiet for a long time. He asked if he could begin uncovering. Marvella said yes. What he uncovered over the next 2 hours, while Marvella sat at the table and Bette stood near the door, was the life's careful work of Earl Tuck, who had not been, as it turned out, simply a failed grain operator with a drinking problem. Earl Tuck had been a serious, methodical collector. He had spent the better part of 30 years acquiring specific things with specific knowledge, and had documented everything in composition notebooks stacked on the lowest shelf, which Speer found near the end of his survey and carried to the table with both hands. The objects fell into several categories. There were antique firearms, a percussion cap rifle with a maker's mark Speer identified immediately, 2 Civil War-era revolvers in original condition, and a wall-hung presentation piece in a fitted case that Speer examined with a loupe for a full 4 minutes. There were mechanical items, an apothecary scale, a surveyor's transit in its mahogany box, a set of drafting instruments. There were documents, land surveys, government land patents, county plat maps from the 1880s, rolled and sealed in a tin. And along the back wall, packed in excelsior that had dried to straw over decades, were coins. Speer uncrated them last. He brought the crate to the table, where the lantern light was best, and he set it down and began removing the tissue wrap packets one at a time. Each one he unwrapped with the cotton gloves and held under the flashlight before setting it on the table. He went through this process without commentary. The table filled. When he was done, he sat back in a chair across from Marvella and looked at her over the spread of what Earl Tuck had accumulated and concealed and left for someone with sense enough to look. She asked him what he was thinking. He said he was thinking he needed a day to go through the notebooks before he could give her numbers. He said the firearms alone, depending on documentation, could represent something significant. He said the coin collection, he paused here and chose his words, was not what most people found in a tin box in a farm building. He said he recognized several pieces that he would need to confirm, but that if they were what he believed them to be, she should not discuss this with anyone until they had spoken further. She asked him to be a little more specific. He looked at her steadily. He said that the collection appeared to include pre-1933 gold coinage in quantity, some of it in grades he had not personally handled outside of a museum setting. He said there were also what appeared to be early territorial pieces, low mintage dates, and at least 2 coins he could not yet identify without reference materials, but that he intended to look up that evening. Marvella sat with her hands flat on the table. The lantern flame moved slightly in a draft from somewhere. She said, "And what would something like that be worth?" He said he could not give her a responsible number without completing his review. Then he said, carefully, that in his experience of 40 years doing this work, he had walked into perhaps 4 rooms that gave him the feeling this room was giving him, and in all 4 cases the numbers had been larger than the family expected. She thanked him. She told him to take the time he needed. He asked if he could photograph everything in place before he left. She said yes. He spent another hour photographing. He asked to borrow 2 of the composition notebooks to cross-reference that evening, and she said yes to that as well. Then he gave her his card, which she already had, and he shook her hand again, and he left. Bette waited until his Subaru had turned out of the clearing, and then looked at Marvella and said, quietly, "Grandma." Marvella was still sitting at the table. She was looking at the coins spread out under the lantern light. They were old and dense, and they caught the flame and held it. She was thinking about Earl Tuck, whom she had never met, who had died before Bernard brought her home to Hatchet County, and she was thinking about what it takes for a man to spend 30 years quietly accumulating proof of his own faith in the future without telling anyone on the chance that someone would eventually come looking. She was thinking about the note Bernard had tucked in the spine of his Bible. "Find a red door, please." He had known this was here. He had known what it was, or had understood enough to know it was something. And he had left it for her. She said to Bette, "I want you to stay close this week. There are going to be things that need doing, and I want you nearby when I do them." Bette said she wasn't going anywhere. Marvella nodded. She began rewrapping the coins in their tissue, 1 packet at a time, and returning them to the crate. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. The call from Dale came on Saturday morning. He had driven out to the Cutter's Mill property, he said, and found tire tracks in the clearing and evidence that someone had been in the building. He wanted to know what was going on. His voice had the particular texture of a man who has spent a night convincing himself he has a right to be concerned, when what he actually is alarmed. Marvella told him she had been out to look at her property. He said, carefully, that they should probably talk about the property, because in his estimation the sensible thing was still to let him take over the tax situation and manage the eventual disposition of the land. She said she was managing it herself. He said, less carefully, that she should understand she was not in a position to make complex decisions on her own at this point, and that he was only trying to help. She said she understood exactly what position she was in. She said she would be in touch when she had something to tell him. She said goodbye and set the phone down without waiting for his reply. She sat with her hands in her lap for a moment after that. The anger was there, clean and specific, not the hot, unfocused anger of a person who has been surprised, but the cold, particular anger of a person who has been underestimated for a long time and has finally decided to stop accommodating it. Raymond Speer called on Sunday evening. His voice was different than it had been on Friday, or rather it was the same voice, but with something beneath it that had not been there before. Not excitement exactly, because he was a disciplined man who had made a career of not getting ahead of verified fact, but a quality of sustained attention that told her he had not stopped thinking about this since he left the building. He said he had gone through both notebooks and made reference calls to 2 colleagues he trusted. He said he wanted to come back on Monday with a colleague from Beckford who specialized in numismatics, the study of coins, and that if she would permit it, he would like to bring a second appraiser for the firearms as well, someone he used regularly and whom he would personally vouch for. She said that was fine, he said, and he paused here in a way she had already learned was characteristic of him when he was choosing precision over speed. He said that on preliminary review, the collection was more significant than his initial assessment. He said he wanted to wait for the second opinions before he put a number to it, but he wanted her to know, going into Monday, that she should be prepared for the conversation to be a substantial one. She thanked him. She told him she would be there at 9. She sat with the phone in her hand after she set it down. Through the kitchen window, the October dark was complete. No moon, just the yard light throwing its orange circle on the gravel drive. The calendar on the wall was still open to August. She looked at it. She got up and turned it to October. It was a small thing. It was the right time. If you're still with me as that door starts to open, do this story a kindness. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell. These quiet stories don't get told if you don't share them. Tag someone who loves a good discovery story in the comments. Let them know we're telling these the way they deserve to be told. On Monday morning, Marvella arrived at Cutter's Mill at 8:45 before anyone else and let herself in through the red door alone. She lit the lantern and set on the table. The room held the same stillness it had held when she first walked into it, but it felt different now. Less like abandonment, more like patience. The difference between a room that has been forgotten and a room that has been waiting. She took the second letter from her coat pocket, the one Bernard had mentioned in his first letter, which she had found taped to the underside of the table on Tuesday and carried with her since. The second letter was shorter, more specific. Bernard had written that Earl told him 3 things before he died, that he had not trusted banks since 1933 and had acted accordingly, that every piece in the collection had been chosen and documented and would hold up to scrutiny, and that the collection belonged to the woman Bernard married, if she was the kind of woman who would come looking. He had never met Marvella. He had died 6 years before Bernard brought her to Hatchet County, but he had left the door red and the key with Bernard and the patience to let it all sit until the right person came. She heard tires on the gravel outside. She folded the letter and put it away. She was ready. Speer arrived with 2 colleagues, Dr. Ardith Coles, a compact, precise woman who worked in numismatics at the University Extension in Beckford, and Garfield Pruitt, a large, slow-moving man with the hands of someone who had handled old firearms for a long time. They shook hands with Marvella and with Bette, who arrived behind them, and they went to work. It took most of the day. Dr. Coles spent 4 hours with the coins, working through each piece with tools from a fitted case, making notes in a tablet. Pruitt examined each firearm with the patience of a man constitutionally opposed to rushing, and at one point he brought the presentation piece in its fitted case to the table and sat with it under the lantern light for 20 minutes in a way that told Marvella, without words, that he had found something he had not expected. Speer moved between them, cross-referencing the composition notebooks. Marvella sat at the table and let them work. She had learned a long time ago that the quality of a result is related to the quality of the space you give the person producing it. At 4 in the afternoon, Speer asked if they could sit. They gathered at the table. Dr. Coles set her tablet face down. Pruitt set his notebook beside it. Speer folded his hands and said that in 40 years of appraisal work, he had walked into 3 rooms that gave him the feeling this one did on Friday, and that he was confident now this was the 4th. The coin collection, Dr. Coles said, was one of the most complete private accumulations of pre-1933 American gold coinage she had personally examined outside an institutional setting. The condition grades were exceptional. There were confirmed rarities. She named 3 dates and mint marks, and the weight of them was clear in her voice. Her preliminary assessment, conservatively stated, placed the numismatic value at a figure she wrote on a piece of paper and slid to Marvella. Marvella looked at it. She set it face down without showing it to Bette. The firearms, Pruitt said, were documented by the notebooks and in several cases by original receipts folded inside presentation cases. The percussion cap rifle was a named maker of significance. I always knew that was you. I want you to read the rest of this carefully, Marvella, because there are things here that require decisions, and the decisions belong to you, not to Dale. To you. I am leaving this to you because you earned it, which is more than I can say for most things I did in my life. You raised that family. You kept this family. Whatever is in these shelves is yours to do with as you see fit. There is a second letter taped to the underside of the table. Read that one after you've had a chance to look at what's here. Don't let anyone rush you. Don't sign anything. Don't let Dale in through that red door until you understand what you have. I loved you better than I showed you. I know that's not enough. I'm sorry it isn't. Bernard, she read the letter through twice. Then she set it flat on the table with her palm resting on it. The way she had steadied 100 pages against wind, against time, against the feeling that something important might blow away if she didn't hold it down. The lantern burned steady. Outside, the wind moved through the goldenrod, and Bette was sitting in the Civic with the heat on, waiting, the way a person waits when they understand that what is happening is larger than they should interrupt. Marvella stood up from the table, the letter still in her hand, and walked to the nearest shelf. She reached out and untied the twine on the first covered shape. The canvas fell away. She stood looking at what was underneath it for a long time, without speaking. Then she went to the next one, and the one after that. Outside in the clearing, the October light was going thin and flat, the shadows pulling long from the tree line. Bette checked her phone, then set it down. She did not go to the door. She understood without being told that this was not her moment to enter. She sat with the heat running and watched the red door stand closed in the fading afternoon, and she waited for her grandmother to come back out. It was nearly 40 minutes before the door opened again. Marvella came out carrying the lantern in one hand and the 2-page letter in the other. She pulled the red door shut behind her and locked it with a long-barreled key and put the key in her coat pocket. Her face was composed in the particular way that is not the absence of feeling, but the careful management of more feeling than a face can hold all at once. She walked to the car and got in the passenger seat. Bette looked at her and did not ask right away. She waited. Marvella sat with the letter in her lap and the lantern on the floor at her feet. The light had gone out when she came outside, but she had brought it with her anyway. After a moment, she said, "I need you to drive me to see someone tomorrow. Not Ashworth. Someone else. I need to find out who handles things like this." "What kind of things?" Bette asked. Marvella looked through the windshield at the red door. "Old things," she said. "Valuable old things." The name Marvella came home with that evening was one she had found not through any lawyer or official channel, but through the woman who cut her hair. Rosalie Finn had been cutting Marvella's hair for 19 years in a shop on the backside of the hardware store, and Rosalie knew everything that mattered in Hatchet County because she had been listening to people talk for 31 years without ever giving them reason to stop. Marvella called her from the kitchen that night, explained in careful general terms that she had come into possession of a quantity of old objects and needed someone with expertise, and Rosalie said, without hesitation, Raymond Speer. He was a licensed appraiser out of Beckford, the county seat, 40 years in estate work, not cheap but honest, which in Rosalie's estimation was the rare quality. He specialized in antiques and historical artifacts, and had handled 3 or 4 estates in the county where families had found things they did not understand, all with discretion. Marvella wrote down the number. Then she sat at the kitchen table and looked at the wall where Bernard's calendar still hung, open to August. She had not taken it down. She was not sure she was ready, but she looked at it now with a feeling she could not entirely name, something between grief and a slow, spreading anger at the waste of it. The years he had carried this alone, the years she had been kept outside a door she hadn't known existed. She did not sleep well. She did not expect to. In the morning, she called Raymond Speer. He had a deliberate voice, unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned that the quality of his listening was worth more than the speed of his answers. She told him what she had, a quantity of covered objects on shelves in an old agricultural building, untouched for some years. He asked 2 or 3 careful questions, then said he could be out on Friday. She said Friday was fine. She did not tell Dale. She did not tell Patrice. She thought about this choice and made it without guilt, because Bernard's letter had been explicit and because she had spent 49 years deferring things she should not have deferred. Bette came with her on Friday, as she had come on Tuesday, without being asked twice. It was the kind of loyalty that does not announce itself, And Marvella noticed it the way she noticed most things that mattered, quietly, and with the intention of acknowledging it properly when the time was right. Raymond Speer was a tall man in his late 60s, spare and gray-haired, who drove a Subaru wagon with a box of equipment in the back, flashlight, jeweler's loupe, cotton gloves, camera, and a loose-leaf notebook he wrote in by hand. The presentation piece had a verified provenance, placing it in a major collection in the 1890s, confirmed that morning through a reference archive. He wrote his figure below Dr. Cole's and pushed the paper back. Marvella asked Speer for the total. He wrote it below Pruitt's number, added subject to final verification, and slid the paper to her. She looked at it for a long time. The lantern burned between them. She folded the paper and placed it in her coat pocket. She thanked each of them, asked about next steps, security, insurance, the process of finalizing the figures, and she listened to all of it with the same focused attention she had given everything this week. When they were gone and the red door was locked, she stood in the clearing with Bette in the last of the daylight and looked at the building. The corrugated steel had gone nearly purple in the failing light. It looked solid. It looked, if you were paying the right kind of attention, like something that had been carefully kept. Bette said, quietly, "Are you okay?" Marvella said she thought she was. She said she needed a night to sit with it before she decided on anything. There were things that needed to be done in a particular order, and she wanted to think about the order. They walked to the car. Marvella got in and sat with the envelope in her lap and the key in her hand and looked through the windshield at the red door until Bette started the engine and the headlights came on and the door receded into the dark. 49 years, she thought. He had carried this for 49 years and had not known how to bring her into it, and had finally done so in the only way left to him. She thought about what it costs a person to keep something that size in silence. She thought about what it cost to let it go. She was not sure yet whether she was angry or grateful. She thought perhaps she was both, and that both were earned, and that she had the rest of her life to sort out which one she intended to lead with. She sat with the phone in her hand after he hung up and looked at Bernard's calendar, still turned to October. Then she got up and turned it to November. Supper on Saturday was pot roast, low and slow in the cast iron with onions and 2 bay leaves. Bette arrived at 5 with bread from the bakery and sat at the kitchen table while Marvella finished the gravy, and they talked about small things first. Betty's work at the extension office, the weather, whether the Finley family had sold their south parcel. The easy conversation of 2 people comfortable enough to let the important thing wait until the food is on the table. When they sat down, Marvella said she wanted to tell Bette what she had decided, and she wanted Bette to say what she actually thought, not what she thought Marvella wanted to hear. Bette said she understood. Marvella told her the number. She said it plainly, without preamble, the way she would have told her the price of something at the hardware store. Then she watched Betty's face, which went through several things in quick succession before settling into a careful quiet. She said, then she told Bette what she intended to do with it. She said she had thought about all the available options, selling the collection privately through Speer, placing it at auction, liquidating in pieces over time, and she had decided on a different path. She was going to hold the collection, not forever, but for now and not idly. She had spoken with Speer about the right way to insure and properly store it while she made arrangements, and he had given her the name of a facility in Beckford that handled institutional grade storage for private collections. She was going to transfer the collection there, have the final verifications completed, and take the time to understand what she had fully before she made any permanent decisions about its disposition. She was also, she said, going to stay in this house. She was not moving anywhere. She was not signing over anything. She was not being managed into a smaller life to make anyone else more comfortable. And she was going to do something with the Cutter's Mill building. She had not decided exactly what yet, but she was going to repair the roof and secure the structure and take the time to decide properly. The building had stood for 60 years on that piece of land, and it could stand a while longer while she thought it through. But had not spoken through any of this. When Marvella finished, she sat for a moment and then said, quietly, "What do you need from me?" Marvella said she needed Bette to come with her when she told Dale. She said she did not expect it to be a pleasant conversation, and she did not want to have it alone, not because she couldn't manage it, but because she was 71 years old and she had earned the right to have someone in her corner when it mattered. Bette said she would be there. They ate the pot roast. They did not talk about Dale or the money or the red door for the rest of the evening. They talked about the rocking horse Bette had found in a box in the attic when she was 8, the one Bernard had made her for Christmas and forgotten to give, and how he had been so embarrassed when she found it that he had simply stood there in the attic doorway with his hands in his pockets until they both started laughing. They talked about Marvella's mother, who had taught her the pot roast, and Betty's other grandmother, and the summer the creek had flooded and taken out the back fence, and Bernard and Bette had spent an entire weekend rebuilding it, just the two of them, badly, and then paid a man to do it right. Small things. True things. The kind of things that are the actual substance of a life, underneath all the documents and decisions. When Bette left at 9, she hugged Marvella at the door, which she did not always do, and Marvella held on for a moment before letting go. The conversation with Dale happened the following Tuesday in the living room of the house he had grown up in, which was still Marvella's house and which she intended it to remain. Dale sat on the sofa with Patrice beside him. Bette sat in the chair by the window. Marvella sat across from Dale in Bernard's chair, which she had not sat in since August, and which she sat in now deliberately, because it was her house and her chair and her decision, and she intended for all of those things to be clear before she said a word. She told him what was in the building. She told him the approximate value. She watched his face move through surprise, and then through a rapid recalculation that she recognized because she had watched him perform that recalculation his whole life. Every time a situation rearranged itself, and he had to work out where he stood in the new version of it. He said, carefully, that this changed things considerably. He said they would need to think carefully about the best way to handle an asset of that size. He used the word we, which she noted. She said there was no we in this particular matter. She said the collection was hers outright, as Ashworth's letter confirmed, and she had given him a copy of the letter in an envelope when he arrived, which he had not yet opened. She called Ashworth's office Tuesday morning and asked for an appointment. Not to sign anything, she was careful to say. To ask questions. The paralegal put her in for Thursday at 2. Then she sat down at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad she had found in Bernard's desk drawer and wrote out everything she needed to understand. Not what she intended to do. She was not ready to put that in writing yet, but what she needed to know before she could decide. The questions filled 3/4 of a page in her neat schoolteacher's hand, which was what her hand had always looked like even though she had never taught school. She had simply been the kind of woman who wrote carefully on the theory that careless writing and careless thinking were the same condition. Dale called again on Wednesday. The careful reasonableness of Saturday's call had been replaced by something trying to sound like concern and landing closer to pressure. He said he had spoken to a man he knew who handled estate properties, and the man had confirmed the Cutter's Mill building was structurally compromised. He said he wanted to sit down with her before she did anything rash. Marvella said she appreciated the thought. She said she had an appointment with Ashworth on Thursday and would be in touch afterward. Dale said he thought he should be at that appointment. She said she would not be alone. She said goodbye and set the phone down. She had navigated harder things alone than a Thursday afternoon with a lawyer. She had navigated the year after Bernard's first heart scare, when the bills came in and the farm account was short, and she had worked out a payment arrangement with the hospital herself, over 3 calls, without telling Bernard until it was settled so he could rest. She had navigated Dale's adolescence. She had navigated 49 years of marriage to a man who was good in the large ways and sealed in the small ones. And she had done it with her dignity intact. She could manage Ashworth. The meeting on Thursday went better than expected, and she had expected it to go reasonably well. When she laid her legal pad on his desk and walked him through her questions, the legal standing of the bequest, the separation of the Cutter's Mill assets from the general estate, whether Dale had any claim on the building's contents, Ashworth listened without interrupting and answered each question in order. The contents of the building were hers outright. A property bequest carried with it everything inside at the time of transfer, unless the will specified otherwise. Bernard's will had not. The building and everything in it was Marvella's, free of any claim by any other party. She asked him to put that in a letter she could keep. He said he could do that. She asked one more question before she left: whether there was any circumstance under which a family member could challenge a bequest on the grounds that the recipient was not capable of managing it independently. Ashworth looked at her over his glasses. He said such challenges existed in law, but required substantial evidence of incapacity, and that a woman who had come into his office with a legal pad of organized questions and conducted a thorough conversation about estate law was not a woman who would have difficulty defending her competence in any proceeding he could imagine. She thanked him and stood up and shook his hand. Outside on the sidewalk, the November air had gone sharp. She stood for a moment with her coat buttoned and her legal pad under her arm, and she felt something clarify that had been forming for 2 weeks, a decision working its way to the surface through the layers of grief and anger and the complicated business of understanding what Bernard had left her and why. She knew what she was going to do. She had probably known since she stood in front of the shelves in the lantern light and uncovered the first piece. She had simply needed the time to be certain. She called Bette from the sidewalk and told her to come for supper on Saturday. She said she wanted to talk through something, and she wanted Betty's clear head while she did it. Speer called on Friday afternoon with his finalized figures. He had conferred with Dr. Coles and Pruitt and incorporated their final assessments. His voice carried the same careful quality it always did, but underneath it was the particular stillness of a man delivering a number he has had time to sit with and has not grown less serious about. The total preliminary appraisal of the Cutter's Mill collection, he said, across all categories, was between $940,000 and $1.1 million, depending on market conditions at time of sale and the outcome of 2 pieces still under verification. He said he was confident the lower bound was conservative. He said the coin collection alone, in the right auction setting with the right documentation, could exceed his numbers. He said he was sorry to hear of her husband's passing and that it had been an honor to work in that building. She thanked him. She had thought about it during the 3 conversations she had had with Speer about the collection's long-term disposition, and during the 1 conversation she had had with a woman at the County Historical Society who had come to speak with her after Speer had, with Marvella's permission, mentioned the collection's existence to a small circle of colleagues. She said she was going to donate a portion of it. Not all of it. Not yet. There were practical things to attend to first, and she was not a person who made permanent decisions under time pressure. But the documents, the land patents and the plat maps and the county surveys, those belonged with the Historical Society, where they could be properly archived and accessed, and where they would do the most good for the most people. Earl had kept them safe for 60 years. She could see them kept safe for the next 60. The remainder she would liquidate through auction in the spring, when the verifications were complete and the market timing was right, according to Speer's advice, which she had found to be sound. The proceeds, after taxes, after Speer's fees, after the cost of the roof and the storage and the work of the last 2 months, would be significant. She had spoken with a financial advisor in Beckford, a woman named Cormier, whom Ashworth had recommended, and she had begun to understand the shape of what she was working with and what it made possible. It made possible, among other things, the thing she had not said aloud yet to anyone except Cormier, and which she said now to Bette in the clearing while the December cold settled around them, and the new roof caught the flat winter light. She said she was going to set up something in Bernard's name. Not a large thing, not a foundation or anything that required a board of directors and letterhead. A small, administered fund through the County Community Trust that would pay for trades training for young people in Hatchet County who could not otherwise afford it. A practical thing. The county was short of carpenters, electricians, plumbers, people who knew how to work with their hands and repair what was broken. Earl Tuck had known how to do those things. Bernard had known, in his way. The fund would keep that kind of knowledge moving forward into hands that needed it. Bette was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he would have liked that. Marvella said she thought he would. She said she thought Earl would have liked it too, though she had no way of knowing for certain. Only the evidence of a man who had spent 30 years carefully keeping things that he believed would matter to someone, which was its own kind of faith in the future. They stood in the clearing a while longer. The sky was the particular pale gray of a Midwestern December, the kind of sky that holds winter in suspension just above the tree-line. The goldenrod and wild asters were long gone, the field pressed flat under frost. The building stood on its 3 acres the way things stand when they have found their right proportion to the land around them. Not imposing, not apologetic, simply present. She would decide eventually what to do with the building itself. She had ideas. A workshop, perhaps, if she could find the right person to run it. Something practical. Something Earl would have recognized. But that decision could wait. There were things that needed time to become clear, and she had learned in 71 years not to rush the ones that were still in motion. She turned up the collar of her coat. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the key there, the long-barreled key, solid and specific in her palm. She had been handed a worthless thing in a lawyer's office 6 weeks ago. She had driven out a county road to a rusted building and opened a red door and found what a man she had never met had left for a woman he trusted would come looking. She had not announced it. She had not performed it. She had simply done the work, the way she had always done the work, because that was who she was and that was what the situation required. And because when something asks for your patience and your steadiness and your willingness to see what is actually there rather than what someone else has told you to expect, the only answer worth giving is to go and look. Find the red door. Please. She had found it. She had opened it. And what was behind it was not a fortune, though the fortune was real and documented and in proper storage in Beckford. What was behind it was the truth that the life she had built and the woman she had become were not small things. They had not been small things even when no one was looking, even when the room forgot she was in it, even when the chair closest to the door was the one she had chosen and the one she had always chosen because she had learned early to be ready to leave. She did not have to be ready to leave anymore. This was her house. This was her county. This was her key. She walked back slowly to the car through the cold. The red door stood behind her, bright against the steel and the winter field and the bare tree lean, exactly as Earl Tuck had painted it and as she intended to keep it. A door that was different from everything around it, on purpose for a reason, waiting for the right person to come with the right key and the patience to look at what was actually there. She had been that person. She had always been that person all along. It had just taken the rest of them a long time to figure that out. Thank you for staying until the last word. If this story moved you, the next one is already up on your screen. Go give it a watch. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and join us. We tell stories about ordinary people who were overlooked, discarded, and counted out until they found what was theirs all along. See you in the next one. She said she had made her decisions about how she was proceeding, and she outlined them the same way she had outlined them to Bette, without softening or editorializing. Dale said he was concerned about her capacity to manage something this complex on her own. He said it in the careful, cushioned way he had been saying difficult things his whole life, the way that was meant to sound like love and functioned as control. She said she had managed complex things on her own for a long time, and that the appointment with Ashworth and the 2-week process of retaining appraisers and securing expert opinion and organizing the next steps without assistance from anyone except the granddaughter who had driven her to a property she had found for herself had gone reasonably well, in her estimation. Dale was quiet for a moment. Patrice looked at her hands. Bette looked out the window. Dale said, finally, that he supposed she had in hand then. He said it with something that was trying to be grace, but was closer to the recognition of a boundary he had come up against and found solid. She did not mistake it for a change of heart. She knew her son, but she accepted it for what it was, which was the version of backing down available to a man like Dale, and she let it be enough. She said she would keep him informed of significant decisions. She said she would welcome his input when she was ready for it. She said she hoped they could have supper together before the month was out. He said he thought that would be fine. He and Patrice left 20 minutes later. When the door closed, Bette let out a long, slow breath from the chair by the window. Marvella stayed in Bernard's chair and looked at the room. The last of the afternoon light was on the curtains. She had hung herself the first winter they were in this house. Heavy cream-colored linen, which she had never replaced because they were exactly right and nothing that had come along in 32 years had been more right. She said to Bette, I'm going to have that chair reupholstered. I've been meaning to for 10 years. Bette looked at the chair. She said it had good bones. Marvella said it did. She said most things worth keeping did. The collection went into storage in Beckford in the 3rd week of November, transported by a firm Speer recommended who specialized in exactly this kind of work. Marvella was there when they loaded it. She watched each piece carried out through the red door in the hands of people who knew how to carry such things, and she stood in the cleared space of the building afterward with the lantern on the table and the composition notebooks stacked where Earl had left them, which she had asked to keep at the house, and she stood there for a while without doing anything in particular. She was thinking about Earl Tuck, whom she had never met, who had spent 30 years in this building accumulating proof of his faith in the future. A man so thoroughly failed by his circumstances that the outside world had nothing left to see in him. The drinking, the ruin of the business, the estrangement, the long solitary years, and who had spent those same years doing, quietly and without audience, the most patient and generous work of his life. She thought about what that kind of persistence costs. She thought about Bernard, who had known what was in this building for 49 years, and she thought about the note in the Bible, "Find the red door, Marvella. Please." And she understood now that the please was not a request. It was an apology for the sealed rooms in a long marriage, for the things kept so carefully they became a kind of keeping away. She was not angry anymore. She had moved through the anger in the weeks since the will reading, steadily and without drama, the way she moved through most things, and she had come out the other side of it into something that had more room in it. She was not certain she would call it forgiveness, because that word implied a debt that had been named and settled, and what she felt was more like the releasing of a breath she had not known she was holding. A loosening, the particular relief of understanding, finally, what the shape of a thing was, even if the shape was complicated and had costs attached to it. She blew out the lantern. She walked out through the red door and locked it with a long-barreled key and put the key in her coat pocket, where it had lived for 6 weeks, and where it would continue to live for as long as she decided to carry it. She drove back to town in the thin November light. She stopped at the hardware store and bought a new deadbolt for the red door, a modern one with a proper key, because the old mortise lock was the only entry and she intended to have a second one made that she could give to Bette. She bought 2 gallons of red paint as well, the same shade as close as she could find it, because the paint on the door had crazed and peeled and needed another coat, and she had decided the door was going to stay red. Earl had painted it red for a reason, and the reason still held, and she saw no cause to change it. The roof repair happened in December, 2 weeks before Christmas. She hired a crew from the county whose work Speer had seen and vouched for, and they spent 3 days on it, replacing the damaged section and sealing the whole surface, and when they were done the building stood without apology in the winter light, its corrugated steel patched and straight, the red door bright against it with its new coat of paint. She stood in the clearing when they finished and looked at it. Bette stood beside her. It was Bette who said, quietly, "What are you going to do with it?" Marvella had been thinking about this for a month. She had thought about it at the kitchen table and at Bernard's desk and in the chair she had had reupholstered, which was now a deep blue-green that she liked better than the original had ever been.